Ninjago's first venture into the 11-minute format was very divisive, to say the least. I've seen people who hate it, love it, or just kind of feel mixed about it all these years later. The word overhated gets tossed around a lot when talking about Season 11 in general, as the major shift in tone did turn a lot of people off from it. The Oni trilogy was a beloved set of seasons, so going from that to goofy 11-minute episodes about the ninja relaxing and looking for adventure was jarring. So, where do I stand? Well, I think the Fire chapter is pretty decent and a fun installment. It's pretty harmless and can be a fun watch if you want something to take less seriously.
Sir? Interesting perspective.
It's incredibly simple, but it's a fun story. The Ice chapter, on the other hand, is nothing short of a complete disaster. And I know this isn't necessarily a popular take. Much like my Prime Empire video, this retrospective is going to be a more critical look at a season that has aged pretty positively within the community, despite its initial backlash. This video is not meant to make you dislike the season, but to merely share my viewpoints. I'm not trying to convince anyone who enjoys the season that it's bad or doesn't deserve praise. I simply want to share my takes and opinions on a season that I've never really been able to enjoy like so many others have. So, get your traveler's tea, because we're taking a journey to the Never Realm. After Zane is mystically banished by Asphira, Wu is quick to inform the ninja that he has been sent to a place known as the Never Realm. Wu talks about how cold, desolate, and dangerous the realm is, and how even the first Ninjutsu master himself had trouble escaping from it, which I will say is a pretty bold statement and does a decent job setting up the stakes for what our heroes are about to encounter. And I know this episode is technically still the Fire chapter, but it's also the episode that acts as the main setup for the season's plot. And because it's tied so heavily to the rest of the season, I feel as if I should still talk about it. So pretty much the ninja disobey Wu, who by the way was about to strand himself in a distant realm with no hope of returning home because he felt guilty, I guess, and they traveled to the Never Realm themselves, planning to return with the bag of traveler's tea that they had stolen from Wu. But turns out that tea won't actually be able to get them home, and they would be stranded forever. So yeah, again, I have no idea what Wu was actually planning to do if he were to even find Zane. The whole episode just kind of feels like forced conflict. If Wu had knowledge that the tea didn't work, opting to go himself would literally be a death sentence. At least if we're to go by his ominous threats about the realm. Maybe he knew about the Traveler's Tree, but then at that point, why not inform the ninja about something like that? All this conflict does is make Wu look unreasonable, and it also shows that he learned nothing about what happened with Asphira. He just got done learning about the consequences of keeping things from his students and going in to do things alone, something that he had also already learned before, like a lot. I mean, I can't hold the season too much against it. This is a problem that Wu has been in for ages. But it's made even more evident when this episode is immediately following up Wu's conflict with Asphira. I get that they're trying to play off his guilt, but the way they do it is just frustrating to watch, as it completely contradicts everything he supposedly should have learned in the last few episodes. We had the whole conflict resolution with Kai earlier before Asphira broke into the Samex cave. Having the conflict again just kind of feels forced. And again, I realize this is technically a Fire chapter episode, but this episode also acts as setup for the entirety of the Ice chapter. It establishes the stakes and informs us of the basic premise, and in that regard, it does a pretty good job. But in the process, it makes Wu look kind of bad. Whether or not you hold that against the Fire chapter or Ice chapter is up to you. Either way, for me, it's not a huge deal. But I thought I might as well talk about this episode before diving in to the Never Realm, especially because I think it starts to paint a picture of my upcoming criticisms with the season. So once the ninja arrive in the Never Realm, they're immediately thrown into a precarious situation. And while it's a simple scene, I like how this immediately shows some of the stakes Wu was talking about. Not a whole lot, but it shows us an immediate danger and challenge that the ninja must overcome within seconds of arriving within the realm, with this even resulting in Cole losing the Traveler's Tea. So, only a few minutes after arriving in the Neverrealm, the ninja are supposedly stranded with no way of returning home, which we already gathered from the ending of the last episode, but now our main characters are left to realize this for the first time. And just keep in mind the severity of Cole's mistake here for later, because as far as the ninja are aware, he just lost their only chance of getting home and has doomed them to a fate of being trapped in the Neverrealm forever. Just keep that in mind. As we continue, we see more of how the season builds stakes through both intense action and disturbing realizations. The ninja stumbling upon a group of frozen civilians, I think, is the biggest moment in these opening episodes, as it directly shows the consequences of the Neverrealm's perilous nature. This is a good setup. It creates an intriguing mystery as the viewer is left to wonder how this happened, as well as actually showing us the result of those stakes that have been ever so important. And yeah, you've probably noticed how much I've been talking about the stakes, because for this type of story, they're incredibly important. This whole season is set up on the premise of a super dangerous location, with Wu's words setting the bar extremely high for what our heroes could encounter. The thrill of seeing if our team of heroes will be able to even make it out of the realm alive is the central hook of the season, on top of finding out what happened to Zane. These themes of desolation and hopelessness are being established very early on, so I think it's important to keep that in mind as we continue on with the season. Next up, the ninja find a small village and meet Sorla, who tells them that Zane has been taken by the Ice Emperor. And I will say, the season also does a pretty good job of building out this village to make it feel like a real place. Very recently, I began to notice how surface level Ninjago's world building has been overall because of how Dragon's Rising just completely knocked that aspect out of the park. And I went into this video fully expecting to tear into the world building of this season, and while there are major issues with how the Neverrealm is presented that I'll get into later, this small village is actually a pretty good example of how to build out a location and make it feel lived in. We don't see a lot about what the people actually do here other than fish and occasionally defend their home from blizzard warriors, but we do meet a small cast of townsfolk and watch as events take place there. I do have to wonder though, how much do these people actually know? Sorla seems oddly knowledgeable when it comes to elemental powers, and nobody is surprised to see a group of elemental strangers appear from seemingly nowhere. I know formlings exist in this world, so obviously powers aren't new to them, but the idea of elemental powers specifically seems like incredibly common knowledge, which in itself is fine, but it's never explained why. Like many things in the Ice chapter, there are conclusions you can come to in your head, such as the first Benjutsu master leaving tons of knowledge to the realm in his time being there, but without that kind of explanation in the show itself, Sorla's knowledge about elemental powers not only feels out of place, but strangely convenient. With a character like Mistake, she took advantage of being suspiciously knowledgeable because that was built up towards the reveal of her being an Oni, but Sorla doesn't have that. We learn nothing about who this person is, or how she knows so much. She's just here to push our characters and plot forward. Ninjago is no stranger to mentor characters, obviously, but Sorla feels so forced into the story. If they just took a tiny bit of time to explain who she is or how she knows so much, her character would feel a lot more natural. Because at the end of the day, she really is just a plot device in favor of moving certain characters' stories along. And worst of all, she raises questions about the season's world building that don't get answered. And the thing is, none of Sorla's actual advice is very interesting or compelling, which brings me to Kai and Nia's Powerless arcs. Going into the Ice chapter, Kai still had his powers taken from Asphira, so he of course feels useless and unable to help without his powers. They already kinda used up a lot of the emotional conflict from this in the Fire chapter, with Kai pushing his anger towards Wu because he felt useless, but realizing the error in his ways and apologizing. He also found ways to be useful despite not having his powers, but being in the Neverrealm presents him with a problem he easily could have solved had he still had his powers, and he once again feels useless. By this point it feels rather repetitive, but at least the conflict is somewhat compelling. The problem is that the solution is not. Sorla tells Kai not to worry and that his powers will come back in time and true power is never really lost and all that. And she's completely correct, because all Kai had to do to overcome his struggle is to wait and conveniently get his powers back in a time of need. And to me, this just isn't an interesting solution. There's no struggle that Kai needs to overcome. There's no adapting to his new situation. He's just shown as being completely incompetent in the Blizzard Samurai fight, and then gets his powers back when the plot demands for it, in the same episode that the conflict was reestablished. They didn't even give the story more than a single episode. And yeah, to be fair, there's more to Kai's story later in the season that we'll dive into later, but this initial quote-unquote arc for Kai already sets a pretty good precedent for what's to come within the season. It's rushed, it's not compelling, and it's contrived. Kai getting his fire back doesn't feel earned, it feels cheap. The solution to Kai's problem wasn't to think outside the box or do something unconventional for his character, therefore pushing him to grow and learn, but simply just to wait. But the season doesn't only have one bad Powerless arc, but two. Yep, right after Kai gets his powers back, the focus switches to Nia, who is also struggling because she can't use her powers. And it's not even a different emotional response within the characters. Just like Kai, she feels useless and guilty because she thinks she can't help. And the solution? Find a different way to use her powers. And to me, this is just a terrible solution. But before I explain why, let's discuss Nia's story here first. You know, I've gone on record saying that Nia has the most consistent character arc in the entire show, discounting Crystallized, of course. Heck, I made a whole video about it. But something I skipped over in that video was her story in the Ice chapter, because I thought it was simply inconsequential. But no, this is, quite frankly, in my opinion, a terrible Nia story. She was obviously at her worst in Crystallized, but Nia's story in the Ice chapter is so incredibly effective at whittling down her self-worth and agency as a character. So yeah, Nia's story in this season is learning to control ice in order to feel useful in the Netherrealm, and it feels really odd to me that she's just so quick to give up and get angry when first trying. And I say this because I could have sworn her whole arc in Possession was about learning that she wasn't gonna be good at everything she tried, and that she had to learn to embrace the unfamiliar and learn new things. But here she's back to acting the same way she acted when trying to learn water for the first time. It completely ignores all the growth she had gone through. And that's not to say that Nia isn't allowed to still act frustrated. For example, in Seabound, she feels immense frustration due to her guilt and inability to admit fault within herself and asks for help when she needs it. But here, her frustration stems from a character flaw that was resolved seasons prior. She can't do it on her first attempt, so she gets upset. So Nia then trains with Sorla to harness this power, and this scene is honestly just hilarious to me. Nia's trying to control ice, and in the process, Sorla's saying things such as,
"You must only remember who you are and believe in yourself. Change is inevitable. It is the nature of all things. Do not fight it. Embrace the change. You must believe in yourself, Nia. You must only remember who you are."
As if any of what she's actually saying relates to Nia's current struggles. Yes, Nia literally has to embrace the change of water turning into ice, but what other meaning is there to grasp from that statement? What about remember who you are? What is Sorla even trying to say here? She's saying these things as if there's some kind of arc or symbolism going on, but there really isn't. It's like the scene is trying to trick the audience into thinking that there's any depth behind Nia learning ice, but the story is literally just Nia's frustrated that she can't control ice because she feels useless without powers, so she learns to control ice. And that's not a simplification. There's no personal change she's trying to embrace, there's no self-discovery, and there's no remembrance of who she is as a person. The only message that the story is really promoting is that the only way to be useful is if you have powers, and that Nia is nothing without them and must go as far as to learn a different element in order to be presented as a useful member of the team. And that's why I really dislike this solution to Nia's problem. It really feels like that's the message that they're unintentionally sending here, not just with Nia, but with Kai as well. But I'd argue it's much worse for Nia once we see how these Powerless stories come to a close. Switching back to Kai for a moment though, I do really enjoy how the villagers praising Kai for his fire abilities causes him to get a bit of an ego. It's really in character for him, and I love when stories take advantage of plot beats to highlight their characters' recognizable traits. But Kai's story also gets a bit more interesting as we get to a scene later of Kai defending the village from Boreal. And I really like the scene because instead of Kai being shown as incompetent like before, you can see he's genuinely trying his best here, despite his powers not being fully back. And it plays really well off the fact that his powers give him a huge confidence boost, highlighting his tendency to over-rely on them. Something I think his story could have benefited from showing off a lot more previously. It just bothers me that instead of Kai learning to get over his over-reliance on his powers, he instead is practically rewarded for giving into that character flaw. This moment was the perfect chance to show that Kai maybe should start to think of other solutions to his problems than just using his powers. But as the story continues, it proves once again that it's more interested in promoting the idea that you need powers to be useful. And of course, the solution to his Powerless arc is again just to wait until the plot demands for him to regain his powers and save the day, while making the scene super dramatic to make the audience think that it's some kind of big payoff. Sure, this one's better than the first because of the added context of Kai being guilty over not being able to save the village, so he doesn't want the same to happen to his friends, but that story isn't explored. It's set up, forgotten about for a few episodes, then concluded in the exact same manner of his previous power-related struggles. And Nia's is even worse.
You must only remember who you are.
In the same fight right before Kai's big moment, she uses ice to defeat Boreal, only for it to get up seconds later, completely undercutting the moment that wasn't even that strong to begin with. And not that strong to begin with kind of undersells how much I dislike this. The whole remember who you are thing comes back as if it's some kind of big thematic statement for Nia. But like I said earlier, it doesn't really amount to anything of substance. If the show is trying to imply that she must remember her roots as the master of water, then I must continue to question the message that they're trying to get across. Do we really want to reduce Nia down to only being defined by her elemental power? Especially after we had just established in the Fire chapter that living without it is her biggest fear? A lot of people associate the mirror scene from the Fire chapter with Crystallized, but the Ice chapter already attempted to wrap these stories up. It just didn't do a good job, to the point where most people didn't even notice that's what the season was trying to do. It's why I believe that they tried to do it again in Crystallized, but it being Crystallized, they still managed to do it even worse. Regardless, Nia's biggest fear is being normal and not having any powers, and it's a fear that makes sense, as changing from who she was into the Master of Water, a role that was forced onto her due to her heritage, would start to skew her identity of herself and make her forget who she was before she had powers. So, in that regard, remembering who she is would make sense. But that's not at all the context of her story in the Ice chapter. In my opinion, trying to remember how she could solve problems and be effective in her own way before having powers should have been the story here if they wanted to bring her greatest fear full circle and have her learn that there's no point in being scared of being ordinary. But instead, she learns that her identity is completely based on being an elemental master and nothing else. And they were so close to making this story a reality because in the scene prior, Nia is shown taking charge of the situation without using her powers once, and just her skills and ingenuity. We have a whole scene showcasing how competent she is without powers, but directly after that, they turn it back around to Nia needing to embrace being an elemental master to save the day. It completely goes against what was set up previously and throws away her humanity and initiative as a character. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it's very similar to how they messed up the exact same thing in Crystallized. They bring back the whole biggest fear thing and make the same mistakes that this season does. Instead of adapting to life without powers and finding new solutions to problems, she just has to simply accept that she's nothing without her powers. It's far worse in Crystallized because of the added context of everything else going on with her character, but they both spread the same terrible messaging that I feel was heavily overlooked when writing her stories for both of these installments. And at the end of the day, it's pretty much the complete opposite of a character arc. Instead of overcoming her greatest fear, she gives into it. And all of this is even more confusing when you factor in Vex. Vex's entire motivation stems from the fact that he is insecure about being powerless. So in an attempt to get revenge on those he thought mocked him, he seeks greater power, ultimately using it to cause nothing but destruction. And yet, at the same time, the season promotes the idea of powerless people being weak and that you need powers to be a hero. Even Akita's whole journey hinges on her finding an animal form and fearing that if she doesn't, she'll become like Vex. But the story never does anything to challenge what it means to have powers. It sets up a bunch of interesting scenarios, but all lead to the same conclusion. In every one of these instances, it's shown that power is simply the answer to everything. Kai can't protect the people he cares about? Powers. Nia feels useless? Powers. Vex feels like an outcast from society? Powers. Only in Vex's instance, it's seen as a bad thing, while with Kai and Nia, it's seen as a triumph. And just to be clear, I like the angle with Vex. It shows the dangers of letting power and greed for that power consume you, and how being powerless in a society of gifted people can affect someone. But it directly clashes with the ideas presented with the ninja. How can the villain's story be about the dangers of putting too much emphasis on superhuman abilities, while the hero's story is about succumbing to that same very idea? It muddies the messaging to the point where I don't even know what story it is they're trying to tell here. Is placing emphasis on powers a good thing or a bad thing? The messaging simply contradicts itself. And even after all that, I still haven't even mentioned the logic behind Nia being able to control ice and the implications that that has on the story. It's very similar to the problem I have with Sorla and her seemingly infinite wealth of knowledge. Nia being able to control ice isn't inherently an issue, but the fact that it's never brought up or even questioned by the ninja is jarring. Learning that elemental powers have the possibility of overlapping is kind of a big deal, so the fact that Nia never seems to question or even wants to learn more about it is confusing and leaves even more unanswered questions. Why throw something like this into your story if you have no plans on elaborating on it? It's an idea that has so much potential for interesting stories, and should in theory radically change everyone's perspective on how elemental powers work in universe. Just look at Avatar: The Last Airbender, for example, a show that fully takes advantage of its magic system and explores everything it has to offer. In Avatar, the 4 main forms of bending all have overlap with different elements, such as firebenders being able to control lightning, earthbenders being able to control metal, and of course waterbenders being able to control ice. These abilities show a clear distinction in the power level of the user in a way that's natural and builds upon the ideas of the established powers. So switching back to Ninjago, we see how it's clearly more difficult for Nia to control ice than it is water, since it isn't her inherent power to control. But in essence, having her be able to control it in the end makes her stronger for it. Just like how, for example, Toph controlling metal in Avatar represents her sheer strength and excellence in her abilities. The idea of elemental powers being able to expand their skill sets to the point of controlling other elements that overlap should be a groundbreaking discovery, but it's completely brushed over here. But really, in the grand scheme of Nia's story this season, it isn't a huge deal, and doesn't really play into any of my main criticisms, but I thought I might as well bring it up since it's a very strange plot point that really only adds to harming my investment in the lore and world building when pivotal things aren't being properly established or built upon. It makes Nia's story feel even more cheap and wasted than it already is, and even if they went through with the whole shared elemental power thing, it still would inevitably reinforce the bad messaging behind her arc, which is why I feel like they just should not have included it in the first place. Both Kai and Nia had great potential for interesting arcs that could have fundamentally changed their viewpoints on how they see their powers, but instead their stories reinforce the harmful messaging that you need powers to be a hero. In my opinion, their stories should have been about the dangers of over-relying on your powers and finding new solutions to problems without them. Especially when the main villain of the season is only the villain because he seeked power after feeling isolated and mocked without them. Am I supposed to see Nia using ice as self-discovery? Because to me it feels like that implies that she's only herself because of her powers, which is the exact opposite message that I feel should be portrayed with her character, and is one of the main reasons Crystallized failed at properly portraying her. Are you telling me that Kai, someone who places so much of his confidence in his powers, should continue to only rely on said powers to help protect his friends and those around him? Because again, it's the exact opposite of what I feel Kai should be learning. Neither of these characters should be defined by their powers, especially when the harmful consequences of said powers are at the forefront of the main conflict of the season. The messaging just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right with these characters, and it doesn't feel right with the themes that the story is trying to portray. But now that that's all out of the way, how does the Ice chapter fare when handling its other characters? Jay and Cole don't really have much going on this season as compared to the other ninja, with especially Jay not really having any form of story. and I feel it's honestly rare that we see a season that gives everyone something to do. So, if anything, I think it's pretty commendable that Jay is the only character in the main cast to not have any sort of story. Though it does create the issue where, while almost every main ninja has a story within this season, a lot of them feel very underdeveloped or underutilized, and Cole definitely falls victim to that. And with how the other characters are handled, it actually makes it so that Jay, out of all the ninja, is the one that I have the least complaints about. Yes, he is by far the least interesting character here, but because he does like absolutely nothing, there isn't really anything for me to complain about here. Yeah, his humor doesn't land very well, and I could criticize the voice pitching, but other than that, I don't really have much to say on Jay this season. Now with Cole, on the other hand, he gets a nice little story that I think is vastly improved with the hindsight of Master of the Mountain, much like many of his other side stories throughout the show. But when it comes to Cole's side stories, I think this is definitely one of the weaker ones. Cole's story here revolves around the guilt he feels after dropping the Traveler's Tea. It is a natural progression of how Cole would be feeling at this point in the story, but it's the execution that I think kind of muddies the severity and tone of the situation. The Ice chapter as a whole kind of loses its identity in its inability to keep a consistent tone. Sometimes it wants to be lighthearted, other times it wants to be taken rather seriously. And both of these tones have been balanced pretty well for the majority of Ninjago's run, but that's the key thing. Balance. Unlike other Ninjago installments, the season doesn't really do a good job at balancing its heavy and comedic tones. Rather, it mixes them together, resulting in moments where I'm not really sure how I'm supposed to feel about a situation. Cole has an exaggerated dream about the ninja's reaction to him dropping the Traveler's Tea, causing his guilt to get the better of him. But everything here is played for laughs. Even when running into a kid in town and expressing his issues, it's displayed so comedically, which in itself isn't a bad thing, but given the context of the situation, it is pretty confusing. Cole basically stranded himself and his friends in a realm for all eternity, which is a pretty serious consequence of his mistakes, and should tie in well to the themes of disparity and hopelessness that were set up in the first episode. But the juxtaposition of the stakes of Cole losing the tea versus how childish his guilt is portrayed creates a super inconsistent tone. Am I supposed to feel bad for Cole here, or laugh at his expense? The show portrays this conflict as something that isn't meant to be taken seriously, yet it hinges on the ninja's survival, something I pointed out as being one of the main hooks of the season. And yeah, I made a big deal at the start of the video about how well set up the stakes were because it's true. The season does a really good job at making you fear the Neverrealm, but these scenes begin to trivialize the danger and make the conflict not seem as important, especially when it's revealed that there's such thing as a Traveler's Tree, and there you go, problem solved.
According to legend, it is the most distant and remote of all realms. My father only spoke of it to me once. He told me of all the realms of creation, it was the one I should never visit. He told me it was a cold and dangerous place. He went there only once and said he nearly couldn't find his way home. It is called the Neverrealm because they may never return.
Oh, that's not a big deal. Just go to the Traveler's Tree.
One of the biggest conflicts of the season is simply resolved by climbing up a mountain and picking berries from a tree. And while Krag is hinted at being some dangerous foe that Cole would never be able to survive, the conflict is trivialized again once it turns out Krag is just misunderstood. And it's not a bad idea for a story, that being the feared Yeti actually turning out to be innocent, but we are told that the Neverrealm is this cold and dangerous realm that's impossible to escape. We're shown on multiple occasions the danger of the realm, only to have a set of episodes that makes it seem super easy to traverse and escape from, and kinda just makes the conflict seem insignificant and like the punchline of a joke. And I'll give the season credit where it's due. It's still capable of pulling off strong and powerful moments without any misplaced comedy or jokes to get in the way. We even see it later on with Krag. But things like Cole's guilt being played as a joke and the Traveler's Tree being such an easy solution really makes me start to lose my investment in the central conflict of seeing if the ninja will make it home. The rest of what they do with Cole, however, is pretty good.
Hey guys! Boy, are we glad to...
Showing the effects of the Ice Emperor's rule through an isolated Yeti who's only seen as a monster from the outside world makes for some really powerful moments and imagery. The show does a good job at making me actually feel for Krag, and I think in hindsight, Cole was the perfect character for this story. It shows his unmatched selflessness and kindness as he's able to see past what everyone else believes Krag to be. Krag does stick around for the rest of the story, but I feel as if he peaked here, which in all honesty shouldn't really be the case given that this is his introduction. I really wish they explored the bond between Krag and Cole more, as well as the idea of Krag being perceived as a monster for so long.
I can get more! Right, Krag? You can help me back up the mountain and we can...
It is no use.
With most civilizations, the Blizzard Samurai merely froze all the inhabitants, but here it is shown explicitly that the Yeti were killed. That implies a whole lot of interesting ideas of how they were viewed as potential threats, and I think that could have allowed for a lot more introspection and expansive world building. So while I can appreciate what the story does right, I find it hard to connect with it on a deeper level since it does little to actually explore Krag as a character. As a few isolated episodes, it's fine, but I fail to see how it manages to play into the grand scheme of the season, besides offering more context behind the ruthless rule of the Ice Emperor. And we don't really see much exploration or resolution on Cole's guilt once he gets the Traveler's Tea leaves. That whole conflict is never really mentioned again, despite it actively being brought to a close. It makes the Cole and Krag stuff feel very disconnected, despite sharing screen time. How does Cole helping Krag tie into his guilt about losing the Traveler's Tea, despite the super surface level solution of just finding more tea? It's another example of the season providing an interesting conflict, but pairing it with a super boring and unearned solution. And at the end of the day, I just can't take the whole escaping the Neverrealm conflict seriously, which is made even more of a joke with the bait and switch near the end of the season. There's no point in having the scene other than to trick the audience into actually being worried about the conflict for once, since by this point, any sense of danger or stakes have been completely demolished. But don't worry, we'll get to that soon. This scene is just so incredibly desperate for any type of emotional response, and makes the conflict even more of a joke than it already was. So now I think it's about time we get into the main plot line of the season. That being the journey to rescuing Zane. The main plot of the Ice chapter centers around Lloyd as he goes out to try and find and rescue Zane, facing obstacles and meeting new characters along the way. Lloyd in this season is really strange to me because I understand what they were going for with him, but I just don't really love the execution, and I think it sets a precedent for how Lloyd would be handled throughout the 11-minute era. With the Oni trilogy having such a big focus on Lloyd, it makes sense that his story here would be a lot more toned down and laid back while attempting to build off of his characterization from those installments. March of the Oni partially leaves Lloyd off on a kind of an empty note. He doesn't get much of a resolution with Garmadon, and his feelings about what happened in Hunted aren't really followed up on. So it's nice to see that the Ice chapter attempts to show us where he's at mentally after everything that went down, and how he's still actively thinking about Harumi and Garmadon. They could have easily left that stuff in the past, but they make a point of showing us how that stuff still affects him. But when Akita's revealed to be human, I think this is where they kind of lose me on Lloyd's characterization. A big part of Sons of Garmadon was Lloyd realizing the consequences of putting your trust in people, and as a result, he risked shutting himself off to others and being less trusting. So I see where the writers are coming from with Lloyd's reaction towards Akita during this scene. Lloyd once again feels betrayed and lied to, but they portray him so dramatically angry and harsh that, to me, it just feels out of character for him. Ever since the conflict with Harumi, he had still been shown to be working through his struggles, presenting himself as a positive and helpful person, even when faced with adversity. Yes, he had his moments of anger, but it was rarely directed at anyone else, only really himself. He got angry with Garmadon, but in the context of the moment, it was fitting since there was a whole season of build-up towards it. Hunted's story for Lloyd was all about him regaining his hope in the world and his hope in others, reclaiming his voice and his core values. But now he's back to super shut-off Harumi angst mode. Which, sure, it's a good idea to build off those emotions from Harumi since we didn't really get a proper follow-up, but the way they do it just comes off as a little too much. It feels incredibly out of pocket. I get that Lloyd is less trusting after his experiences with Harumi, but he flat out assumes the worst from Akita before even being able to hear her out. And look, I'm all for defending character flaws, as they often make characters feel more real and human, but those flaws have to be portrayed realistically and in character, while also being resolved in interesting ways. And to me, the actions Lloyd takes in the scene doesn't feel like something Lloyd would do. He immediately assumes the worst in a complete stranger after all they did was try to help him. Lloyd has every reason to be shocked that Akita actually has been a person this whole time. But downright anger is not the emotion I would associate with him in this specific context. He could feel ashamed about everything he told her. He could feel slight annoyance that she hid her identity from him. And I don't even have a problem with Lloyd having reservations about her and choosing not to trust her. But flat out angrily accusing her of being untrustworthy without even trying to understand who she is or where she's coming from is not something I think Lloyd would do, even after the events of the Oni trilogy. Not to mention how childishly immature it's portrayed here.
I can explain.
I'd like to see you try. You didn't know if I could be trusted? That's rich, considering you're the one who can't be trusted.
I meant no harm.
Well, too late. Harm done.
Are you calling me a liar?
Maybe I am.
Take it back.
No.
Which would lead me to believe I shouldn't be taking this seriously, but then in that case, I wouldn't really want to put much value on the story they're trying to portray here. If you want to have a story about Lloyd overcoming his feelings about Harumi and past trauma, wouldn't you want to portray it in a way that would make me feel more inclined to take it seriously? Because the only reason I'd assume Lloyd's reactions are so exaggerated here is for the sake of comedy, and I just don't think Lloyd's reaction here works in the context of this scene. The whole interaction just feels incredibly shallow and out of character for Lloyd. And hey, this maybe would be fine if this was just the beginning of the story, and they fleshed it out throughout the rest of the season and gave Lloyd some kind of arc. But no, it's resolved like 2 seconds later, and it feels super unnatural and unauthentic given the interactions that had just transpired.
Now stay away from me. I only travel with people I trust.
I am sorry I deceived you.
I'm sorry too.
Lloyd having sympathy for Akita's wound here, despite her being someone different from who he thought she was, is a good moment and does a good job at portraying who Lloyd really is, but you can't have that directly after mischaracterizing him for an entire interaction. It just feels like he switches up so incredibly fast. It doesn't feel realistic, nor does it feel earned. Just imagine Lloyd seeing Akita and assuming she is like Harumi, keeping his sympathy intact and going to help her pretty much showcases that he learned nothing from Harumi, and that if in the same position again, he would have gone to help her had a similar thing occurred.
For both our sakes!
So does Lloyd see Akita as a Harumi type person or not? And what here makes him change his mind or think any differently from literally a few seconds ago? And they even frame Akita as being the one in the wrong for hiding herself from Lloyd.
You told me everything about yourself, and I told you nothing. I will share my tale with you, if you will still hear it.
Yeah, Akita could have been more transparent, but Lloyd's reaction is still incredibly uncalled for, and the resolution feels super rushed and contradictory. Why even have this as a conflict if it's only gonna be for a single scene? It's as if the writers wanted to portray how Lloyd reacts to these types of situations after the Oni trilogy, only to decide that they didn't actually want to go through with that story. If you're gonna have Lloyd have such an extreme reaction to show how he's changed over the course of your story, why go back on it seconds later? This isn't a story about Lloyd learning to come out of his shell and have trust in people like I feel the writers initially wanted. All it does is paint Lloyd as unlikable for a scene to generate some conflict before initially turning around and saying, never mind, they're friends again. I don't see any value behind that. It doesn't expand Lloyd's character in any interesting ways. It doesn't build off the themes of the Oni trilogy in any interesting ways. It had the potential to do that. It's a good idea for a story, but they never actually tell that story. Maybe I'm completely missing something, but I just don't see how this works as an arc. Even if you were to find no issue with Lloyd's characterization here, the resolution still feels so rushed and cuts off any potential for a story before it can even begin. And also, this scene right here is one of the closest ways I can connect Lloyd's story back to the mirror scene. In this brief moment of what I believe to be blatant mischaracterization, Lloyd is acting most like what he fears the most, Garmadon. Instead of seeing the good in people, he shuts himself off so he can focus on nothing but surviving for himself. And even then, I think it's a bit of a stretch to assume that's what the story was trying to imply. And like I've said, the resolution here isn't natural and it simply reverts Lloyd back to his normal self within minutes. Just like with Kai and Nia, there isn't really a story here, it's just the illusion of one, and his greatest fear isn't resolved. But I think it's about time I finally talk about Akita. And to probably a lot of people's surprise, I'll say that Akita is actually one of the highlights of the season. But to me, that's not really saying much, as in a season where I pretty much dislike or feel indifferent to every single character, Akita stands as one of the characters I have the least complaints about, but probably still the most positive things to say about. That being said, I kind of fail to find her story very compelling. I've already discussed why I feel her drama with Lloyd is forced, but that pretty much all had to do with how Lloyd is handled. Akita's attitude towards the whole situation is honestly just kind of funny, and makes me build sympathy for her, and her jabs at Lloyd are totally deserved. Akita is also responsible for what I believe to be the best episode of the Ice chapter, the last of the Formlings. Yeah, the animation is far from perfect, but I admire the attempt since these 2D episodes were probably done on a pretty limited budget, and I think that the style benefits the episode more than it takes away from it. The episode is just a really charming and even somewhat tragic standalone story. It builds upon the world of the Neverrealm while giving added context to Vex and his motivation, and by the end the consequences of the Ice Emperor's rule is enforced even further. It's a very standard story with Akita finding her animal form and encountering an event that would act as her call to action, but I appreciate how it weaves into the already established narrative. Akita's theme is also one of my favorite pieces of Ninjago music, with the soundtrack in general really elevating the presentation of this episode. So yeah, Akita has a great episode to set up her backstory and make the audience sympathize for her, but she doesn't really do much else throughout the season to actually warrant the time we spend setting up her character. They have an interesting dynamic established with Akita, seeing Zane as nothing but a villain who destroyed her home while Lloyd has to convince her that he's his friend, but the confrontation is boiled down to one incredibly short interaction in the finale. The scene on its own is good, with Lloyd trying to convince Akita not to let her anger control her, but they never really do anything with this idea since it's already the final episode, and the resolution with Zane never requires Akita's stance to be challenged. Nothing that happens even really requires Akita to be involved in any capacity, which is a huge shame since she's a likable character and has an interesting backstory, but just doesn't really add anything to the overall story or successfully challenge any existing characters' viewpoints in any interesting ways. The ideas are there, but they aren't really used, and it makes for a character that kind of feels wasted. Not to mention that I don't really buy into a relationship with Lloyd. Once Akita is human, she and Lloyd barely spend any time actually interacting as friends. There's one scene that I find really nice, but that's just before they get separated, and they're at odds in the last few minutes of the finale. I just don't find Lloyd and Akita to be interesting as a basic character dynamic. There isn't enough screen time of them actually being friends to buy into it, and both conflicts they share in the season pretty much amount to nothing, with the first one, like I complained about earlier, being resolved in a completely rushed and unnatural way. So at the end of the season hinting at even more towards that relationship, it just doesn't really work for me, and it comes really out of left field. And with the ending hinting at a return that even the writers themselves were probably unsure of, it makes for a really unsatisfying ending, as we're left with a cliffhanger to a story that will most likely never continue, or at least doesn't seem planned to anytime soon as of the time of writing this video. I know a lot of people like Akita and her dynamic with Lloyd, and while I want to like it, the season just doesn't do enough for me to get invested in either of their stories. Akita is set up well, but nothing is really done with her character past that point. There were good ideas with Lloyd having to regain trust in others after his experiences in the Oni trilogy, but that story is promptly mishandled and discarded as soon as it's introduced. The season brings up themes of revenge taking you too far with Akita, but doesn't actually explore it. There are good ideas at play here, but the season does the bare minimum in terms of building upon them, to the point where any story that they try to tell just feels completely wasted. So, just before I finally give my thoughts on Emperor Zane, here's a quick list of stuff both positive and negative that I wanted to mention but didn't have anywhere else in the script to put them. First off, much like Akita, Kataru doesn't really add anything to the season past his introduction. He starts as a red herring for the Ice Emperor plot twist, has one particularly chilling scene, then kinda just follows Lloyd around. The fact that he is even captured is odd, due to the fact that Vex had no reason to not just freeze him in the village with everyone else. Who knows, maybe he did have a reason, but it's never explained. He's just an odd inclusion that really only acts as a way to give Akita more stakes towards her motivation. Overall, he's a harmless addition, but I really wish they actually explored this character more, and the bond he shares with his sister, because the season doesn't really make me grow attached to him enough to be rooting for his rescue. Next up, I wanted to point out that the design of the Blizzard Samurai and Ice Emperor are really cool. and every shot that takes place in the Ice Emperor's throne room is really well done. I don't know, I guess I just really like epic looking shots and super well designed rooms. Really makes the Ice Emperor seem more threatening, and there's just some really cool imagery here, so I gotta give the season props for that. The overall vibe of the Ice chapter is done pretty well, and the score is absolutely phenomenal. It's definitely a top 3 Ninjago soundtrack for me. I can definitely see why people grow attached to the presentation of this season. All the settings look great, it has some of the best character designs in the entire show, and again, that score is so good. I will say though, besides the select few locations, the Neverrealm does look pretty visually uninspired in my opinion. For being a completely different realm, it really does feel like a place that could just exist in Ninjago. It is just kind of your average snowy wilderness. But like I said, I must give it props for certain places like the Ice Emperor's castle and even Akita's village in the flashback episode. The presentation definitely helps the season be more enjoyable, but overall, Ninjago has pretty good presentation to begin with, so it's not enough to really save the season, for me. Though I can't deny, it has a very distinct and appealing visual identity. And people probably expect me to hate on episodes like the absolute worst, but honestly, I don't really mind the quote-unquote filler episodes of this season, but I will say I am really not a fan of the Kaiju Protocol. The absolute worst is pretty harmless in my opinion, because it really doesn't take itself the slightest bit seriously. Yes, it's really annoying how it takes up time that could have been used to properly flesh out a lot of the stuff I've been complaining about, but I think with better writing and pacing, or a more focused story, that stuff could have been fixed regardless. And its inclusion does really mess with the flow of the season, but as a singular episode, it is not that bad. It's a pretty fun time. I can definitely see how it's not for everyone, but I don't think it is as egregious as a lot of people say. The Kaiju Protocol, on the other hand, yeah, this episode is not great. Not only is it placed at a really terrible spot, that being right after the reveal of the plot twist of Zane being the Ice Emperor, which completely brings the story to a screeching halt, but it also kind of really messes with the idea of realm travel, contradicting conflicts from older seasons. Multiple plot points in past seasons hinge on various ways the realms can be accessed. One of the biggest examples being the fact that Harumi needed to get all 3 Oni masks in order to open a door to the departed realm to revive Garmadon, but apparently Traveler's Tea is just able to bring you right there, as well as plenty of other realms, including the Cloud Kingdom, which previously was only able to be accessed through the Blind Man's Eye. And I could also complain about the logistics of the Preeminent, and I feel how her defeat kind of undermines the conflict of Season 5, but I think the Traveler's Tea is important because of how relevant it is to this season's plot of trying to get the ninja home. All these new rules about how the tea works and what it can do just don't line up with stories that we've seen previously, all for the sake of having an episode that really didn't need to be here. And also, this whole departed realm being able to be opened by Traveler's Tea really implies a lot of weird stuff, considering the fact that the ninja at any time could have just gone into the departed realm and brought back any characters from the dead, including Garmadon, before he was revived in his Oni form. So it still causes problems, regardless of whether or not Harumi needed the masks to summon the Oni version specifically. But anyways, now that that's all out of the way, strap in because it's time we talk about Ice Emperor Zane. Everyone knows that Ice Emperor Zane was a story with a ton of missed potential. Even the biggest of Ice Chapter fans will agree with you on that. But this plot point is far more flawed than just having a rushed ending. Ice Emperor Zane is a completely wasted concept that creates more questions than it answers, doesn't act as a satisfying twist, and barely even alters the trajectory of the plot. Not only is it missed potential, but it's also practically pointless. Like almost everything else I've talked about in this video, it's a story that doesn't even really tell much of a story. There's no meaningful message or narrative here, when there easily could have been one. First, I need to explain why I think that in the context of this season, Ice Emperor Zane is a flawed twist. My main issue stems from the fact that this twist doesn't really do anything to actually shift the story in any meaningful ways. Sure, Zane is the Ice Emperor, which is a departure from what the audience is supposed to initially believe, but looking at the actual story, what about it doesn't necessarily change? Lloyd's original goal is to get Zane back, and upon learning this information, his goal doesn't change. He still needs to get Zane back. And, as I'll talk about later, the outcome of the finale puts Zane in a position to where having been the Ice Emperor is completely inconsequential. The point of a plot twist is to radically change the outcome of a plot, but this twist doesn't do anything to actually change the fact that Zane is rescued and the Ice Emperor is defeated with ease. The Ice Emperor could have been his own character who simply loses by being defeated in combat, and I think that would have been a less frustrating ending. Zane is basically still a prisoner, whether he is the Ice Emperor or not. The way they wrote Zane here, him being the Ice Emperor only adds to making the world and story of the season confusing. It's not a bad idea for a twist. Having one of our heroes end up as the main villain of the season is a cool concept on paper, but in this specific instance, it barely changes the actual plot. It brings up interesting ideas, but never actually challenges our main characters to approach the season's conflict any differently than they would have otherwise. In fact, Lloyd is the only one of our main characters to even interact with Zane here, and like I said in the section about Lloyd and Akita, their dynamic is given an interesting shakeup due to this twist, but it isn't explored in the slightest. It's just one short back and forth, and I think the main reason that Zane being the Ice Emperor feels so inconsequential is because of Vex. Vex is really the main villain of the Ice chapter, which inherently isn't too bad. I mean, Vex is just kind of a basic revenge story, and I don't think he really has the charisma or on-screen presence, such as a character like Pythor, to really pull it off. But he's not a bad villain by any means. We are told in the last of the Formlings about the shame he felt when not getting an animal form, and how he felt he was treated poorly by others, which acts as his motivation for abusing Zane's power for himself. But we didn't need Zane to be the Ice Emperor for him to do that. He could have simply been a prisoner. And with Vex being the puppet master, it makes it so that his story is the forefront, with Zane being left as kinda just a plot device. The twist claims that Zane is the villain, and that's why we should be shocked, but he isn't really. It makes the twist ring so incredibly hollow and feel cheap as a result. Just like so many other moments in the Ice chapter, it feels like it's trying to make you feel a certain way without actually putting any effort into telling a compelling story. And that's not even to mention the way that this twist absolutely destroys any sense of intriguing world building the season had left. We're told that the Ice Emperor had been ruling for decades, and here's every bit of explanation for that new groundbreaking piece of information.
Decades? Time must be different here.
What about the time difference? How do you explain that?
I can't.
It's like they wanted the Zane Ice Emperor twist, but they also wanted the story to be set decades into the Ice Emperor's rule, which is an issue since Zane only arrived there like a day at most before the ninja did. Of course, the characters point out the inconsistency, but the season never actually explains it. It's a major plot hole that the show itself points out to the audience without making any attempt to solve it other than, time must be different here. Anyways. And the whole decades of rule thing didn't even have to happen either. Yeah, that information makes the conflict seem more intimidating, but at the cost of completely ruining any immersion I had for the Neverrealm and the story. The twist actively makes no logical sense within the context of the season. Sure, showrunners have tried to clear things up online since, but the fact that that's even necessary is a huge issue. This isn't some fun trivia tidbit or missing piece of lore. It's a contradiction that makes me question the entire concept of the Neverrealm and how it even works. Does time actually work differently? Am I left to assume time moves faster in the Neverrealm than everywhere else? If so, shouldn't the ninja have shown up at the monastery seconds after leaving? Because it seems like the way it's presented, the time moves the same. I'm sure everyone who has seen this season already understands why this is so confusing, so I don't need to harp on it too much longer, but I really do think it goes to show how much of the Ice chapter story wasn't very well thought out, to the point where major plot elements and explanations behind central plot twists aren't explained and instead left to the viewer's interpretation. Familiar. Anyways, I'm not done with Zane just yet because the missed potential of his story this season goes even further back than a poorly done plot twist. And that's the actual backstory behind the twist itself, which is a huge part of the missed potential behind this twist. During the season, the characters keep pointing out how Zane must have been corrupted by the scroll, and that's why he's evil. Which would make sense. The scrolls were set up in the Fire chapter and were shown to corrupt those who used them. So yeah, it would make perfect sense that Zane, after being trapped in the Neverrealm, would become reliant on the scroll for survival and would slowly fall victim to its temptations, causing him to slowly lose morality and overthrow the realm. It practically writes itself. But that isn't actually how he turns evil. He just gets unplugged during a diagnostic, which causes him to lose his memory and get manipulated by Vex. The scroll does nothing but make him more powerful. Due to Vex unplugging his system, he's completely unaware of his morals and self-identity, and because of this, his story lacks any sense of self-initiative. See what I mean when I say Zane here is less of a character and more of a plot device? Because I think this is the most non-human he has ever felt as a character. Say what you want about Detective Zane or Pirate Zane, Zane Day, and all those moments where Zane is defined purely by the fact that he's a robot and he does funny robot things. No, this is the worst offender of Zane's downfall as a character. I can at least laugh at goofy modern day Zane, but here I just feel bad for the guy, and more importantly, I feel robbed of an actual Zane-centric story. But at the end of the day, he just gives into his biggest fear. He's just a lifeless robot with no free will who can easily be reprogrammed. And big surprise, these aren't ideas that the season bothers exploring. It simply reinforces that idea. I don't think I need to sit here and explain why Zane getting his memories back is a completely rushed and unsatisfying ending, but it is so unbelievably forced. And not only that, but it throws out any other interesting messaging out the window in favor of shoving the same quote from season 1 down our throats for the millionth time. How is this thematically relevant? It's not. Zane discovering his original purpose would be a big moment if he actually had been struggling with his own identity, but he was too busy with amnesia to even be aware of what was happening. So much to the point where he doesn't even question anything and walks away from the season like nothing ever happened. And with the swing of his staff, decades of terrible rule are undone in mere seconds. No repercussions, no questioning from his friends, no guilt from Zane, not even a hint of sympathy for the people he indirectly hurt. Sure, it wasn't Zane's fault, but he still did everything we had seen and were told he did. And that is something that should deeply affect his character, but it doesn't. He might as well have just been rescued from a jail cell and brought back home like the red herring ever so desperately wanted us to believe, and I honestly would have preferred that. There's no reason for this story to exist. It does nothing for the character, it does nothing for the world, and it definitely doesn't do anything for the story. It's completely wasted potential, and for me it drags down the entire season by trivializing the conflict and making me feel nothing but disappointment in what the story could have been. It's no secret by now that I have a lot of problems with the season, but most of them boil down to the fact that it presents interesting themes and either completely fumbles them or doesn't even bother exploring them. When thinking about the Ice Chapter's themes, what I think it was trying to be a story about was power. Personally, however, I would have fully capitalized on this idea and connected every character's story, or at least as many as possible, with this theme to create a narrative that challenges the idea of powers and the dangers of relying on them. Kai and Nia feel weak without powers, but both of them have lost sight of what they could do without them. Kai should have had to learn not to over-rely on his powers and to come up with new solutions to problems, as he had begun to connect his self-worth and ego to his abilities, causing dangerous habits that would ultimately bring up guilt within himself when people needed him most. And Nia should have learned that she had always been more than just the master of water, remembering who she was before she became an elemental master, and finding that there's nothing wrong with being ordinary, as it never stopped her in the past. Lloyd should have learned that power doesn't make someone different or untrustworthy, or even inherently evil, even if it's something that's unfamiliar to him. Yeah, he's having a hard time opening up to people and he's a tad apprehensive, but he knows that there's power in forming bonds with others over survival, which is something his father never would have recognized, giving him reassurance that he's doing the right thing. And lastly, Zane should have fallen victim to the temptation of the scroll in order to survive in the Neverrealm, losing sight of the danger of his powers only to question his own free will that the scroll had challenged, making him come to his own conclusions about the power he has and making a difference in the Neverrealm. There are of course other characters such as Cole and Akita, but I think their roles simply should have been actually explored, as I don't think that they were mishandled, just severely underutilized. Cole's story isn't given the severity it actually deserves and is played off more as a joke and lacks an interesting resolution, while Akita has a really great setup but just doesn't really do much for the rest of the story, causing her to kind of fall flat. And these are all just ideas off the top of my head for how these characters could have been all connected by a common theme. But there are plenty of themes you could choose from this season. In reality, the Ice Chapter fails in my eyes at delivering a single, well thought out or compelling narrative. It tries to go for a ton of different ideas, but never does anything meaningful with any of them. It's a world that at first feels rich and interesting, but falls apart as the season continues. Poor messaging and cheap conflict resolution, as well as any lack of deep or even surface level storytelling, keeps me from enjoying almost every character story the season has to offer. The lore is a mess, the main twist amounts to nothing, and leaves me questioning so many things about the season's world building, and I simply can't get invested in really anything that's going on. In my eyes, the Ice Chapter is nothing but a complete mess. But hey, if you like it, that's great. After all, this video is just my overly long and hyper-analytical opinion that realistically nobody asked for. If anything, I hope you at least found this video entertaining, or maybe even informative. Thank you so much if you made it to the end of this video. This is a way larger project than I thought it was gonna be, but I'm really proud of how the video turned out, so hopefully you enjoyed it. This video was meant to be out before the end of 2023, but it wasn't. But I still do want to take the time to thank you guys so much for all the support in 2023. The channel did absolutely amazing, and yeah, just thank you guys so much for that. And on the streams too, I've been streaming and doing a lot of really fun events, and it's been a great time. So streaming is definitely a thing I want to do a lot more of in 2024. As far as videos go, I want to cover a lot more Monkey Kid stuff. The next video is probably going to be a Monkey Kid video, and then we'll cover Ninjago again. And yeah, again, just thank you guys so much for all the support in 2023, and I hope we can continue on through 2024. And yeah, thank you again for watching this overly long video on the Ice Chapter, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.